Hello, class. Hope you all are doing well. I'm going to try and change things up a little bit this week and record your lecture instead of one long lecture into small, sort of bite-sized little chunks into different categories. This week we'll be talking about Pavlovian conditioning. You also have your exam this Friday. It will be available from 8 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. You'll have 1 hour to take the exam unless you reach out to me and we have separate special accommodations for that. And that will cover including this material. So it will cover all of the material and all of the folders under module 1 that had been posted up until your exam. So now we're going to talk about Pavlovian conditioning. It's also called respondent or classical conditioning. They're all sort of equivalent in name, and they don't make a particular difference as into which one you use, just historically, depending on whether you have more experience with Pavlov. Some fields call it classical conditioning, others will call it respondent conditioning, but it's all the same principles. So classical conditioning is, let me just make sure this is being shared correctly for you. And share sound. Classical conditioning is a big important component of a lot of dog training. So here's just an example of how to train your dog not to bark at something that is leveraging a classical conditioning technique. So I'm going to go ahead and show this to you now, and then we will talk about classical conditioning today, and hopefully you'll make the connection of how this in of itself is classical conditioning and how it can be leveraged for a variety of cases for dog training.
Dog not to bark. Episode 1, Barking at Noises. Both of my dogs don't bark at very many things, but however, when our washing machine broke, I found out that my Chihuahua became very reactive to the washing machine. Dogs bark for many reasons, whether it be anxiety, arousal, fear, nervousness, irritation. They're barking to communicate an underlying problem. If you don't address the underlying problem and instead punish the communication, punish the barking, you still get that underlying problem, but you don't know about it because the dog's not telling you. Step 1. Change your dog's emotional response to the stimuli. Here you can see I'm clicking Kiko for being calm in the area that she usually barks. The washing machine is not on, and she's getting clicks and treats for just hanging out in that area. This conditioning exercise will give her a head start for the next step, which is adding the noise of the washing machine. Step 2. Working from low levels of criteria to higher levels. Here I am using Pavlovian conditioning, pairing the sound of the knock with a treat. The same with Pavlov's dog that drooled because the owner paired the noise of a bell with food. The dog started to really love the sound of the bell. So in the same way, I'm pairing the noise that comes from the washing machine with food. So I'm changing Kiko's emotional response to that noise, where before she thought it was a scary, terrifying noise or an arousing noise, and now it's just the signifier that something good is coming. Therefore, there's no need to bark at the noise. You can either use just the noise itself to signify the food is coming, or you can click and feed. If you notice your dog is nervous or starts barking, you're going too far too quickly. You need to lower the criteria. So for instance, you could stand in the other room feeding a treat for the noise, or clicking and feeding for the noise, while someone knocks on the washing machine in the distance, and then just bring the dog closer and closer. Adding criteria. The new criteria is that the washing machine is now on, making the scary noise. I'm clicking and treating Kiko for remaining calm in the presence of the noise of the washing machine. We'll get closer and closer to the washing machine while she's still under threshold. If she ever were to bark or react to the washing machine, that would mean we were going too far too quickly. I didn't edit out this part in the video because it shows you that I moved too quickly at this step and Kiko became reactive, so I moved further back, where she could succeed. The final result is the dog being in the presence of the stimuli without worrying about it. Dogs bark because they are over-aroused. Startling a dog by saying no or shaking a can of pennies can actually cause stress hormones to be produced. So even if the barking is suppressed, the dog is actually more aroused than before. Here are some tips. 1. Identify what causes the dog to bark. 2. Reinforce the dog during those situations before the dog thinks to bark. 3. Interrupt your dog when they are barking. Call them to you, change direction if on a walk, so that the barking is not reinforced. 4. Prevent barking when you are not around. Leave the TV on. Don't allow the dog access to what they usually bark at.
Okay, so welcome back. Let's get our slides back up. That video highlighted and leveraged a technique that was primarily Pavlovian conditioning to try and reduce that barking. We'll talk about what Pavlovian conditioning is today, but just know that that entire sort of training practice there was really leveraging a Pavlovian conditioning technique. And we'll try and highlight how that was done. So it's definitely a very important component for our animal behavior and training, specifically things like counter conditioning or desensitization, which is what that procedure is most typically called, which is in of itself a form of Pavlovian conditioning. All right, so for this chunk of lecture in Pavlovian conditioning, at this point, I want you to be able to describe and know how to apply it. I want you to be able to generalize and identify, like for example, watching that video, hoping that by the end of this, you would be able to identify how this is Pavlovian conditioning. What is the conditioned stimulus? What is the unconditioned stimulus? What is the unconditioned response and the conditioned response, which refer to CS, US, UR, CR. So CS, conditioned stimulus, US, unconditioned stimulus, UR, unconditioned response, CR, conditioned response, and be able to identify that and essentially take any scenario and be able to apply that appropriately. Be able to describe and apply counter conditioning, which is what that procedure was that we just saw with reducing the barking. Be able to describe clicker training in the Pavlovian sense. So in other words, how is clicker training or the use of a clicker in and of itself utilizing and leveraging Pavlovian conditioning. Then be able to identify and describe important features of Pavlovian conditioning, such as acquisition, extinction, recovery, and be able to come up with good examples of each scenario that you'd be able to apply for your exam. Okay, so we've talked about reflexes in depth last week. That's particularly important because that comes up in Pavlovian conditioning, because essentially there's always some kind of underlying reflexive response to some degree that is leveraged within Pavlovian conditioning. So we always have what we call an unconditioned sort of stimulus and an unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus is the thing that elicits a response, and this is typically a reflex. So the unconditioned aspect are going to be your biologically unlearned kind of reflexive response. It's not dependent on any type of learning or behavioral history. In other words, this sort of comes on board because of your membership within a certain species and not because you necessarily learned it. So these responses tend to be quite uniform across a member of a given species. The conditioning component is what sort of changes all of this. The conditioning component is where the individual or animal learns to either modify their response, produce a different response, or produce a response to different stimuli other than the ones that they were biologically prepared to respond to. So like when you see or smell food, you will start to salivate and start preparing, getting yourself ready for that subsequent consumption. That is unconditioned. That is a reflexive response. And there's a smell of different kinds of foods. You start to salivate. That's coming along essentially biologically prepared for you because it prepares your body to be able to consume things. The conditioning component comes in when there are other stimuli that are become associated with the food, like the sign of McDonald's arches or the sound of your microwave turning off, or you know, someone in the kitchen cooking, or certain smells that are associated with food. All of those things will get your sort of salivary glands going, but you necessarily weren't born with this smell of bacon causing that. What you were born with was bacon in your mouth causing it. And what you've learned is that the smell of bacon is associated with you soon to be eating bacon or something thereof if you're vegetarian, such that whenever you have that smell of that particular food, your body is preparing to consume it. So what we're going to be focused now today on Pavlovian conditioning is going to be the conditioning of these reflexes. This is where Pavlovian conditioning relies on. Our last week and lectures were focused on level 1, the unconditioned responses. So Pavlovian conditioning, where does this all come from? This comes from Pavlov. Over to the right is not actually Pavlov, but rather one of the followers of Pavlov. He's quite famous because of well, one, for determining sort of Pavlovian conditioning. That's probably one of the other reasons. But he was probably one of the preeminent scientists in Russia at the time. He was also quite popular in the United States. And also he used dogs. So one of the few sort of major psychological research that was done with dogs was with this. Pavlov in of himself he wasn't a psychologist. He didn't start off interested in psychology and trying to understand animal behavior. He was actually a physiologist. He was interested in digestion, and he wanted to understand the digestive process that essentially comes about, starting with digestion within the mouth through salivation. So he wasn't measuring salivation just because he thought that this would be something that the dogs would learn to do, and I shall call it Pavlovian conditioning. What he was learning, or what he was trying to study, is the production of salivation for preparation and for digestion of food. What he found, however, is that before he was even giving the dogs food, they started to salivate. From his perspective, at first, this was quite annoying, right? Because you're trying to understand how salivation interacts with food. Well, if the dogs are salivating before they even get food, this is quite inconvenient because it's not allowing you to understand the relationship between the food itself and the salivation. But instead of just saying, wow, this is annoying, let's just ignore it or move on to something else, understand is, why are the dogs salivating before they even get food? So it was initially termed psychic secretions, basically that the dogs had become psychic in the sense that they were preparing for and somehow knew that food was coming. And one of the first observations was that gentlemen that were working in the lab, and he actually also had some women in the lab, which was quite unique for these times, early 1900s, they would all wear white lab coats. And in other times when they weren't wearing white lab coats, wasn't going to be around feeding time. So they learned that when people were wearing the white lab coats, this meant that it was coming close to feeding time, and then they would start to salivate. So to test this hypothesis, or this idea, essentially what Pavlov does was set an entire experiment where he used stimuli that he could control better, other than simply the showing up of an experimenter or the use of a white lab coat. And he actually used a metronome. We typically associate Pavlov with the use of bells. Does that ring a bell? This was actually a mistranslation from Russian to English when Pavlov gave one of his few presentations over in the United States. And from some of the text, he actually used a metronome. So for those of you who are musicians, You probably know what a metronome is. It's basically kind of like a, think of it as the sound of a clock, but just going back and forth, making a particular tone, noise, and keeping to a particular pace. Whenever this sound was being presented, that would then come to, whenever that sound was presented for about 30 seconds, then that led to the presentation of food. And then Pavlov essentially found out that the tone itself, or the metronome itself, would elicit a salivary response even if he never gave them food. They would just start salivating when they heard the sound of that metronome. And this was quite interesting because this is taking a reflexive response, which he was trying to study to begin with, which was food in the mouth and salivation, and that it can be changed and modified by the dog's learning history such that when they hear a metronome, they begin to salivate already. So then he studied a variety of phenomena associated with that, which essentially became the basis of what we now call Pavlovian or classical or respondent conditioning. So Pavlov's lifetime was 1849 to 1936. A majority of the work was going to be done in the early 1900s. The 1920s is when Pavlov first came over to the United States. And it was in 1907 when he switched his lab over from the study of digestion to the study of conditioning. At that time, he was already famous as a physiologist. So the top right is actually Pavlov instead of the bottom right. He noticed that his dogs would salivate to the site of a scientist, which he then called psychic secretions, which is what, I just talked about. So Pavlov's dogs originally put food in the dog's mouth. The dog would salivate. And we would just do this largely over and over again because he was trying to study the physiology of digestion. However, doing this a few times, whenever there was something that came to predict that they were going to put food in the dog's mouth, they would begin to salivate beforehand. And this is a dramatization of Pavlov, I think, putting something in there, just kind of a Google Images picture. But now we've come to provide specific terminology for this. Essentially, I want to highlight, let me pull up my highlighter here, pen. So here, this top, we have our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response. This is basically the baseline reflex that we had already talked about. So the relationship between food and salivation, this follows the law of reflexes, right? Where essentially if you increase the magnitude of food, you get an increase in the reflexive response of salivation. You increase the magnitude, you get reduced latency to respond for salivation. And that there's a certain amount of food that is required to produce the salivation, which is the law of threshold. So these are all going to follow the law of reflex because this is your basic reflex. You can take over some of that reflex through a learning history. So here, a arbitrary stimulus, which a lot of times we'll call a neutral stimulus at first, but in this case becomes the conditioned stimulus that, that's weird. Essentially, if you present a metronome to a dog, and you can do this if you have a dog at home and a metronome, I guess, and you put a metronome in front of them, chances are they're not going to start salivating. So there's no particular response to this metronome. It's an unlearned kind of stimulus. And we set that this is our to be conditioned stimulus. We associate the metronome with the food by turning the metronome on some period of time right before the food is presented. So our conditioned stimulus occurs, then our unconditioned stimulus occurs. And we'll talk later about sort of the order and how these two stimuli are presented together is actually really important and how learning occurs. But we go through a conditioning phase where we associate this metronome with the presentation of food, which leads to ultimately salivation because you have this food unconditioned stimulus. But the key Pavlovian conditioning aspect, or the conditioning aspect, is that now we can just simply present our conditioned stimulus and we anticipate seeing a prepared response which is typically salivation or is typically similar to the unconditioned response. We'll actually talk about several examples today or through this week in which the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned response actually look very different and typically and sometimes can actually be the opposite effect. So the conditioned response and unconditioned response are usually the same, like they are in this case, but not always. They're not necessarily the same. So the conditioned stimulus is a thing that you're being conditioned. The animal is learning, condition, learning, condition, learning. So we're trying to condition or teach a new stimulus by pairing it with an unconditioned stimulus, so something unconditioned, something unlearned, something that is biologically prepared and produces some type of reflexive response, which is our unconditioned response. So our unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that produces a response prior to training. Our unconditioned response is a response to the unconditioned stimulus prior to training. Our conditioned stimulus is initially neutral stimulus that becomes paired with our unconditioned stimulus. And our conditioned response is a response to the conditioned stimulus that only develops after the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus have been repeatedly paired. So conditioned response here would be our salivation. Our conditioned stimulus is our metronome. Our unconditioned response is also salivation, and our unconditioned stimulus is the food itself. So here is an example that comes up quite frequently in training contexts. Is you have a stimulus that is initially neutral, right? If a puppy is born and you say, good boy or good girl or good dog, it's not going to have any particular response. But it comes to develop an illicit response because you associate good boy with some unconditioned response. And in this case, it could be food. It could be good boy, here's some food. Good boy, here's some food. Or good girl, here's some food. And the conditioned response that we expect to get from that is going to be some sort of food preparatory behavior, or typically something related to what that unconditioned stimulus produces as a reflexive response. So here, obviously, salivation would be one of them, but we can also see other types of responses like turning away and paying attention to the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned response can actually look a lot more complicated than simply salivation. We always talk about it as just salivation because that's the easiest thing for you to learn in Psychology 101 in high school or in college. But in reality, the conditioned response is actually going to be a much more complicated array of behaviors that are essentially activated by whatever that unconditioned stimulus is. So a variety of biologically prepared behaviors that is associated with your unconditioned stimulus, like receiving food. Okay, so let's break off into another sort of follow-up video. Oops.
Behavioral psychologists have come up.
Let me just make sure I'm sharing sound.
With new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
Oops.
The biggest mistake women can make when it comes to
Ooh. Problems with YouTube. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you appreciated that very old and kind of strange video, but it does recapture a lot of the things that we were talking about. And I always forget how strange that particular video and that gentleman is. If you want to go meet him, I think he's a professor at Stanford, if you want to enjoy his weirdness in person. Anyway, so that's going to wrap up phase 1 for right now. We're sort of grouping 1 as a short little video to introduce you to Pavlovian conditioning. Next, we'll talk about more aspects of Pavlovian conditioning that was hinted towards in the video, like acquisition, extinction, which was also talked about, and then a variety of other components and examples. So I'll break here now and see you in a little bit for the next parts.